Hi, everybody. What you're about to see is the recording of our game design breakdown series with Tomo Moriwaki. For this episode, we covered Code Vein and Souls Likes, but due to YouTube related issues, there's a lot of breaking up and issues when it came to connectivity. But I managed to record basically the talk from right after the intro. So, after I'm done here, you're going to see it pretty much unedited from that point. So, let me know what you think in the comments below, and enjoy this discussion on Souls Likes, already in progress. But, let's get to our topic here, and we're going to be talking Souls Likes. Probably one of my favorite of the more recent genres of the last decade, and as the story goes, it all kind of came to a head with Demon Souls. That game that nobody really, I think, knew at the time what was going into that one. Did you ever have a chance to play that one, Tomo?
Just a little bit, and I mean that's the thing is it felt like they were trying to bring back some old school vibes, and it was rough, and it was a little weird, and it wasn't like we weren't getting what they were saying quite yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but boy, things came together pretty quick after that, and I think that they obviously knew where they were headed, and they were onto something.
Mm-hmm. As a quick look up, Demon Souls came out in 2009, which seems like, again, like another lifetime ago for everyone around here. And then Dark Souls, which is the one that kind of took everybody over, took the world by storm, that came out in 2011. So 2 years from Demon Souls to Dark. Are you still there, Tomo?
Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry, I
just want to
was
make
looking
sure.
at the YouTube stream, and it ran an ad and it got confused, and I thought the stream died. What was the question again? Sorry.
That it was a 2 year jump from Demon Souls to Dark Souls in terms of that evolution. I just want to get your thoughts on that, like from a design perspective.
Well, I mean, I think the the dev team is a little bit on the old school side. I think a 2-year dev cycle is actually very conventional, and it's a normal way to think about things from that perspective. There's so much about the game that's kind of built on some of this, this kind of aesthetic in Japanese software development for ultimately for console back then, but of course now everything's different, and that 2 years is just the time it takes to make the next sequel, and that in some ways, like I feel like our DNA as old school developers, we think in blocks of 2 years at a time. So we, let's say if I was on the team and we got done Demon Souls, of course the moment we ship that thing, it's like I got all this stuff I have to think, I have all these thoughts about the game, all this like desire to kind of make the things we almost got good to make it better, and in my head I already have cooked up 2 years of work to get there. So to me it just seems perfectly normal.
Mm-hmm. And with, I guess for you, have you? You said that you played some of these Souls likes. Did you ever manage to finish one of them?
Not really, and ultimately, like, I put a decent amount of time into Dark Souls 3. um, and all the other ones I would just kind of dabble in because too many of my friends would be just way too, like, not too into it, but so into it that it was noteworthy and memorable. And then this would be happening now, over the course of years,
Mm-hmm.
and so you can't deny a game like that. So you got to dig in and do a little bit of studying. It wasn't, I never really, in the grand scheme of things, until Dark Souls 3, I didn't want to sit down and commit that time. Uh, in a lot of ways, like, I'm sure I intimidated others in a time frame when I was playing Mountain Blade Warband, and that they might think the game is really worth playing, but after watching me play it for hundreds of hours, just like, as a Steam friend or just me talking about it, probably like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to wait before I get into it. And I think we've all had those feelings, especially if you play lots of games. And so that's kind of the way the whole Souls genre was for me. I was more of an outside analyst and trying to study the phenomenon,
Mm-hmm.
more than an avid Souls player. And I'm more so now, after finally finding some time to kind of get into it and feel it out. And it was good. It was really cool to kind of feel because there's so much like ancient Japanese slasher game DNA packed into those suits of armor, you know?
Mm-hmm. And as the story goes, Demon Souls was originally inspired by a previous series by From Software,
Yeah, and From
and
Software is like the greatest.
yeah, and I think that's another very fascinating thing about Dark Souls as kind of a genre, or just the whole Souls-like growth, that they've been around for, I think, at least at this point like almost 30 years, maybe 25 years, and they've never, like, up until Demon Souls and Dark Souls, they were never really considered like a top tier game developer. I mean, I love the Armored Core franchise, but it wasn't exactly lighting up the sales charts like other series.
No, yeah, it is. It's worth noting. I mean, I feel like a lot of my buddies were real big From Software fans,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that it had a really strong name and a lot of respect
Mm-hmm.
um, from the small group that were fanatical about their work. But yeah, they didn't explode, and obviously Dark Souls franchise today is kind of at the top of the list. Maybe not the tippy top, but you know, legitimately gigantic.
Mm-hmm.
And they definitely weren't able to find that level of success in their past. But yeah, I mean, they
Mm-hmm.
did they did yeah, I loved Otogi. That was like a lifesaver in that period of time. It's like and then it was a little bit not as on board for Armored Core generally. I liked
Mm-hmm.
it, but it was still like it was kind of floating in that space.
Yeah. Yeah, and Armored Core, like, that's when that a lot of people are hoping that they'll bring back, kind of after, the whole Dark Souls trilogy ended, and we'll probably, like, I don't know if we'll talk about Sekiro today, but we do need to have a discussion about Sekiro, just in terms of all the little weird different things it did, like with them trying to experiment on that. But yeah, like, I think going back to what you were saying earlier about kind of Demon Souls, harkening back to another era in terms of its design, that this was, I think, one of the things that I think really shocked a lot of people. Because if you remember, like, the thousands was kind of that decade of, I think, almost like more mass market appeal. This was when the industry really began to standardize control schemes. There was a greater push to, I think, kind of smoothing out a lot of the difficulty curves that we saw from the 90s and even the late 80s. And if people want, like, a more challenging game, they would normally turn to an independent developer. Stuff like La Brulana, Cave Story. I'm trying to think of some other, like, notable indie games from that era. Braid, Super Meat Boy, stuff like that.
Yeah, and that's the beginning of that era, right? And these other like because something else that's happening in that time frame is the death or the emergence of the big genres, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
it's the death of everything that isn't in a genre. And some of those like because back in the day you could play Ninja Gaiden and you get all the difficulty you need, right?
Yeah.
And though, but that whole game genre kind of stopped being a thing, right? It kind of winnowed down to just maybe one developer holding the torch for a couple years, then another developer trying to make a game like that for another couple years, and then maybe From Software making a game like Otogi again or something, trying to bring back the torch again, and it just barely surviving. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that was an interesting period of time, and we're not even fully recovered from it, really.
No, we're not. Let's see, let me just adjust that here. There we go. That's better. Sorry, I had to just make sure the window was looking a little weird. There we go.
Man,
Yeah,
I was a
and
huge fan of Chrome Hounds.
never played Chrome Hounds. I think that was one that I
Very
missed.
early in the Xbox era, it was kind of multiplayer only. So once people stopped playing it, it just wasn't
Mm,
a thing anymore. You couldn't really play it. But it was a great kind of like action mech design combat experience. And it was really,
mm-hmm.
well, actually, it's worth noting. I never played a Chrome Hound games after that. So I wonder if what is your thought on? I mean, never played Armored. I never played Armored Core 4.
Mm-hmm. I think the
And so if you thought that was awesome, then maybe I ought to give that a shot.
I think the last Armored Core I played was two. I don't think I played them past the PS2 era. I think it's been a long time. We did a classic game night for PlayStation 1 like 2 months ago, and we loaded up the original Armored Core, and that
Nice.
was rough to go back there.
It's tough. It's tough. Like man, those the dramatically reduced resolution is I don't understand how they did it back then. Even though I
oh,
guess I did it a little bit back then.
oh yes, trying to play Maximo on the PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 not really good with high def. That was a challenge when you can barely make out anything on screen.
We had different kinds of imaginations back then. We could fill in the detail of like
Hmm.
a 16 pixel high character.
Hmm. But with the whole kind of Souls-like design, there's definitely like several big areas I want to bring up for our talk. And for those of you watching this live, we're going to shoot for probably an hour, hour 15 at most for this. And again, if we really wanted to, we could be here like all day and night talking about the Souls-like genre. It's just exploded that much. But let's start with some I think we're both well aware of, the gameplay. The Souls-like genre has always been very interesting in terms of its design, because as you said, like around that decade, around that time, we really only saw kind of the hardcore side of things from the AAA in the action genre. Ninja Gaiden, Mad World, and really, I'm trying to remember, like God of War. Like there were a few like notable heavy action games, but again, this was kind of that time when, like we said, like difficulty was moving away. That developers felt that a game shouldn't be hard. It should just, I remember there was this term that I read, player centric design. That you were supposed to design a game with the intention that everybody who was going to play it was going to be able to beat it. And honestly, I didn't really agree with that. And I want to get your thoughts on that one as well, Tomo.
I mean, ultimately it depends, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's that an approach, a player centric approach would be one whose goal is to accommodate new users and
Mm-hmm.
to expand the user base into by just making it feasible for more people to play. That's a great objective.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it is just true. Some of those games are not they're hard in a way that isn't entirely fair. We liked it because for us it was the next step in this natural progression of games. So it's like, yes, I want the next game, and yes, it should be harder, and this is exactly what I'm looking for, and you know exactly what I want because we've had this
Mm-hmm.
close relationship between player and developer for the course of many, many titles and many, many years. But anyone outside that circle,
Mm-hmm.
that game just can't be for them. So
Yep.
so now there are two pieces of that. One, the people who like this game, and if this game can be successful with just those people liking it, this game doesn't need to change. And if changing its difficulty would make your current user base upset or not like the game as much, then in some ways, then these users that you carried to this point, who've supported you to this point,
Mm-hmm.
making that change is unfair to that constituency. But to all the other users that aren't a part of it, if you're interested in getting them on board, then it's like it's not wrong or right. It's just a different kind of user acquisition kind of play. And obviously those games, like the reduction in difficulty in video games to accommodate larger audience over the course of time, we've gone from, 50 million gamers to like a billion
Mm-hmm.
gamers. I mean, whatever, something in there worked.
Yeah. And I think, as you said, there's so many like different things happening when we talk about playability and approachability in a title that I think it kind of gets lost in that discussion because every time, I mean, it seems like clockwork that every time a new Souls-like game is released, somebody puts an opinion piece saying this Souls-like should have difficulty levels, or Souls-like too difficult, or Souls-like easy, that should be the norm. And it's a very hard conversation, especially when we look at the Souls-like genre in its entirety. That so much of the design is really about that high skill ceiling or that high skill curve from the player. And it's been, I think, one of the series, I think, pros, and again, I think it's been one of its biggest barriers of entry for somebody who has never played one of these games and then jumps into it to find themselves just, hopelessly outmatched at the start.
Well, I mean, I I agree with what you're saying. I have a slightly different take in
Mm-hmm.
that my perspective on the Souls games is that they are not as hard as a lot of the games from the past, and that
Yeah.
they're very fair. So what's
Mm-hmm.
interesting about them is that the game doesn't let you get around their mechanics.
Yeah.
So like the simplest way of describing it is you see a bad guy, he's going to swing his sword, you're going to get hit by that sword unless you do something not to get hit by it, whether it be
Mm-hmm.
blocking or avoiding
Yeah.
doing a dodge or something. But what you can't do is just willy-nilly swing your sword
Yeah.
and expect that to be a valid strategy. You
Yeah.
have to follow the rules. So in a lot of ways, the Soul series has taken the difficulty that was present in old school kind of Japanese console slasher and turned it into harsh but predictable, right? You can't
Yes.
like the hit interrupts being the kind of something that makes beat 'em up games work is that it's like we just want you hitting that button a bunch. We want you moving through combat. We want to create a certain amount of excitement and activity,
Mm-hmm.
and so we kind of there's this kind of I can kind of infinitely combo into my enemies, and it's only if I use up resources or make a mistake where I take damage, and that entire script is flipped when it comes to the Souls game.
Yeah.
Hey, there's just a regular bad guy. It looks like he's about to swing his sword at you. What do you want to do? Well, I want to whack, 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 kill him. Oh, I took a bunch of damage.
Mm-hmm.
That's not fair. And that's just that's the first thing we
Yes.
say because we're not accustomed to that rule set. But any Souls player that's played for more than a couple hours, they don't think that thought at all anymore. Now they're like, oh, there's somebody.
He's gonna kill
If
me.
I'm in a hurry, I might just go ahead and take damage from him so I can learn his
Mm-hmm.
patterns and then die and then come back and take him out because that's honestly probably the quickest way to deal with it. But if I'm kind of into the vibe and I'm immersed in the experience, I slow down and I sit there and I watch him. I let him walk up to me. I have my shield up, let's say. I
Mm-hmm.
see him attack, and even though I have my shield up, I still kind of spaz out and I dodge away because I know how harsh the way the systems can be. And then I kind of probe and learn, and I'm like, how interesting it was to
Mm-hmm.
learn how this enemy behaves. And once you learn how the enemy behaves, it is not hard. You
Yeah.
just have to actually follow the rules. It's not like the timings are insane. It's
Mm-hmm.
not what's a good example? I mean, I don't want to keep using Ninja Gaiden
Mm-hmm.
over and over again, but like Bayonetta, for example, right? It's not like there's this like insanely fast, complicated wads of combos and different kind of moves you can do.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you can't do that. You have to avoid that attack. Oh, and now that you avoided the attack, you can hit him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what you said there are about it is mechanically designed to kind of force you to play by its own rules is a very big point about Souls like design because like we said, like to the outside, and I know so many people who don't understand Souls likes have written pieces about this saying that is a frustrating experience, that it's meant to kill you over and over again. But that's not really the case. It is a game that, and I've watched YouTubers and streamers who play Souls likes who tend to kind of try and brute force their way through it. That they'll try and make use of whatever is the most OP build. Like if you could just spam magic, that's what they would do. Like, if they figure out that one spell can just be repeated again and again, they're going to do that. They're not going to learn these systems. And then what ends up happening, of course, is one of two things. Either A, that's going to work and they're going to break the game, or B, they're going to come to a boss or an enemy that can't be taken out by that strategy, and completely lack the tool sets and the understanding of the game in order to get past that fight.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I bet you could do if you could just do a big kind of like psychological study,
Hmm.
you'd find people who are resistant to changing what they think,
Yeah.
right? Would have a lot of extra difficulty in a Souls-like game because even the stuff that you're doing to one enemy, and then once you master a certain kind of
Hmm.
enemy behavior mechanic, you're going to find new ones, and
Yep.
those old behaviors that are optimal for enemies X, Y, and Z are thoroughly ineffective against enemy types A, B, and C. And if you're not willing to
Hmm.
change, right, it's this like sometimes we pride ourselves on being stubborn. No, I'm
Yeah.
going to overcome this obstacle. But packed inside that statement is I'm going to overcome this obstacle the way I want to.
I'm gonna
And
slam my head against that brick wall. I don't care how many times it takes.
I'm a determined person. I'm a
Hmm.
good person. I'm going to overcome this obstacle that way. And in the context of the Souls games, it's almost better to see it as a puzzle game.
Hmm.
You solve the puzzle, you get to go on. Not you hit the button harder.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the very fascinating things about these Souls-like genre is that it's not like from a gameplay standpoint, like you said, if we compare it to classic games, it is nowhere near as difficult as somebody who over this last like 7-8 months been playing NES, and Genesis games. No, it is nowhere near as difficult as those games. But
Oh my god.
like you said, and I think to Draken's point about the first time experience, it is such a flip, I think, for a lot of people. And like you said, most people tend to be very stubborn that if the game doesn't accommodate them, it's seen as kind of an affront to their kind of playstyle. And like for myself, like for those of you who've watched me play like any Souls likes, I just outright refuse to use magic. I like whenever I play a Souls like it is melee or bust because I want to learn that combat system. I want to get as intimate with it as I can because I know that deep down, if I rely on those tools, it's going to come back to bite me in a big way at some point.
Well, some it gets a little tricky. Like if we're
Yeah,
going to use the code vein example, right? Some
yeah,
of the magic kind of reads just like longer cooldown abilities, right? And then
yeah.
it's just becomes kind of a game of fitting them in.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, right, the optimal behavior pattern is to fit them in when it makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, and that's where you get some problems too. Is some of the foundations of these Souls-like games are that their mechanics are simple. And
Mm-hmm.
by keeping the mechanics simple, you don't find players puzzling over
Yeah.
whether they should use ABBA or AAABA against a particular enemy. They're
Mm-hmm.
just watching and they're responding, so they don't get caught up in mastering complex
Mm-hmm.
control inputs. Instead, they focus on complex behavior analysis and observation, which is nice, right? Because what's
Mm-hmm.
happening now is all that matters. To be fair, on the flip side of that, I love games where
Mm-hmm.
I have to figure out these complex inputs to solve various problems. It's a ton of fun, and then to like, in a very Spider-Man 2 control like experience, which is really this is why Spider-Man 2 controls were the way they were. Is so many of us the design staff as gamers we love these
Mm-hmm.
kinds of like I want to be able to take out this hard pack in Ninja Gaiden, these three guys, and
Mm-hmm.
not only take them out and not take damage, but use a varied set of attacks and
Mm-hmm.
have a bunch of style and find an opportunity to do that pause and suck
Mm-hmm.
in those glowing things so I can do the super attack at the end and then basically tell this perfect story of using these complex controls to have this super high performance. Love
Yeah.
that. And obviously Devil May Cry takes that to the next level by
Oh
literally
yes.
having the success in the level you know matter your style and your effectiveness and your quality of execution
Mm-hmm.
mattering.
Yeah, it is almost like two different takes on the action formula. We look at like Ninja Gaiden, Devil May Cry in terms of that kind of high speed, very tech focused combat, versus the Souls likes that Souls likes are they're fast, but like we were to sit like a Souls like next to Ninja Gaiden, it'll be like comparing like a Yugo to a supercar in terms of that kind of
Yeah.
speed. And like you said earlier, it works because like everything is kind of adhered to it. Like, you'll never, or at least in the better Souls likes, you're never going to fight an enemy as fast or as, high speed as something like in Bayonetta. Because your character literally can't respond that fast. And I think there's so many moving parts behind the scenes in a Souls-like when it comes to getting this experience right, and why it is very hard, I feel, to design a good Souls-like. Because if any one of those things feels out of alignment or it just doesn't work, it kind of, I think, causes the whole experience to come tumbling down.
Well, I think it's also just a testament to how difficult it is to create a satisfying 3D combat
Yeah.
game where you fight AI.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's that every piece of that sentence is hard work, right? To create the player package and the movement and the attacks, what the vulnerability windows are, what the not vulnerability windows are. How does an enemy AI interact with those things? Why are your choices that are available to you make this harder or easier with a certain enemy behavior? And then how like all of the pieces are also kind of high cost resource wise. Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
very painful to model like humanoid characters and rig them and animate them, and it's hard to put in all the data for the way attacks should work and tune them up till they feel right and look good
Mm-hmm.
and and play into the game that we're playing. There's basically all these factors that are coming together that make iteration for the end result slow. And so you have to have people who will either they're very good at studying this, which it's not a ton of people because it requires an extraordinary amount of gameplay time as
Mm-hmm.
well as study time and prototyping time if you haven't actually made a full game with these kinds of features. And then so we're left with the originals. These people that have been making these games for the last 30 years, they have the knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
They can take the slow development iteration and still get good results out of it. Um, and so I think there's a lot there. I agree that, and that's just talking about just the 3D combat part. I think all the other parts of the Soul system, like you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
you can get those wrong and it all falls apart because
Yeah.
obviously the game sustains like hundreds of hours of play and there's all this progression in there as well. And it's weird, right? It's not like you keep leveling up your attacks that much.
Yeah.
The game doesn't change so much, but it does somehow.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about designing an enemy who can challenge a player, especially AI, the Soul series kind of brought, I think, to the forefront this idea of random patterns for enemies, especially in the action genre. I think Devil May Cry was probably the first, and I think Demon Souls kind of really capitalized on it. This idea that the enemy isn't going to just do the same pattern again and again. And that, I think, really took a lot of people, like, completely broke their perspective on these action games. Because I've watched people, like, I tune into people who rage quit and watch those, like, rage compilations of Souls likes. And they're like, that's not fair. He didn't do that before. Oh, he did an attack I never seen. And it's like, no, he's just, it's not supposed to be a fixed fight. And some of the most, I think, memorable battles in a Souls like are when you fight like humanoid style enemies, when it is like you versus the AI without kind of the added like fluff of, oh, it's a giant 3-headed dragon, or his hitbox of a tail will literally take up the entire screen when he smacks you with it.
Oh, and it's really hard. Yeah, it's really hard to take a regular enemy humanoid and make fighting him interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That is tough work, and they obviously pulled it off, and with a decent amount of variety. I mean, it actually ends up playing out where it's like I'm having a sword fight with someone, and it turns out that swinging a big heavy metal a piece of metal around is very dangerous, and when it hits me a few times, then I die.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if that actually makes it across in the experience, which is super impressive.
Yeah. And I want to go back to a point Sean said earlier about expanding accessibility by adding easier difficulty levels. Doesn't cost me anything. I think this has always been like one of the, I think, major contention points about like non-Souls like players to people who play the Souls likes. And it's an idea that, again, from the outside, it doesn't look like a Souls-like has any kind of difficulty control. Again, people will assume, oh, it's just pain on top of pain on top of pain. But for people who've played them, a lot of the difficulty of the game is kind of baked into your choices or how you decide to play the game. Like I said a few minutes ago, like if you experiment or you use spells or special abilities, you can mitigate a lot of that difficulty. If you summon people for help, which is probably one of the more, again, like it seems so novel now that, oh, you can just have somebody join your game. But like I remember when Demon Souls announced that, just like blew everybody away. Wait, you mean someone can actually join me and we can actually take this guy on together?
It's awesome. Well, that was, I mean, I think that was probably one of the important steps. It's kind of hidden behind the conversation about difficulty,
Mm-hmm.
is the way in which they integrated multiplayer, the way they integrated other players' just presence in your experience. Those
Mm-hmm.
those bloodstains and those ghostly messages and stuff. That was like a really important step. It I think a lot of players might imagine that it's not relevant from a mechanical standpoint, but in terms of kind of opening up that experience and making,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's a lot of gamers out there who resist the isolating feeling of a true single player experience.
Mm-hmm.
And that this kind of starts loosening things up and opening the doors for more players to come in and give it a shot. And certainly that's partly also why we get some of those results where players are super upset about the game. Like
Mm-hmm.
they didn't quite realize that this isn't their game. They should be playing something different.
And that I think right there that could be, I think, a topic in of itself. That idea of understanding that a game is just not meant for you, like from a design standpoint or just as a player standpoint. I think that's a very fascinating conversation, and probably one that's a little too big for us to get into today.
Oh God, yeah. Well, it could go on forever, but
Yeah.
I have a simple response to that is like Epic Tavern is a game where you have to read a lot of text.
Mm-hmm.
That cuts away a certain percentage of the users.
Yeah. And it is like, again, like I have to resist, the urge to get on this hub. It will be, again, Souls like and game design. That's easily like a 10-hour discussion if we really wanted to get into it. But one of the things I
Well,
think always oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, in terms of other game design related topics that really hit hard in the Souls like genre is me saying that first part made me forget the second part. What was the it's the is how much it revolves entirely around the triumph of
Mm-hmm.
overcoming obstacles, right? It's a very Fiero focused game design.
Yeah.
And that's partly why they can't reduce the difficulty past a certain threshold. It's
Mm-hmm.
like if you reduce difficulty too much, now I don't have to learn the rules. That
Mm-hmm.
means I don't need to play until I figure out what to do and then overcome the challenge.
Yeah.
And since that's an essential part of what drives the experience forward, at that point, difficulty dropping below that threshold actually dissolves the experience at that point.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, some people may be cool with the idea of spending $60 on a game where they're just going to run through and make a bunch of enemies lie down on the ground and collect stuff that they don't quite understand.
Yeah.
That's okay. And also the levels are beautiful and they
Mm-hmm.
are designed pretty awesome. I mean,
Oh,
the kind of Disneylandification in their level designs is top notch.
yeah. And we will be discussing level design in a few minutes. That's definitely a topic that I want to hit on. And yeah, like you said, like when you're trying to make these games feel right, you have to be really concerned with just, I guess, again, like the amount of work you expect the player to do. And like I've been playing Neo 2, and I am very disappointed with Neo 2, and part of the reason for it is that I think they took the wrong lesson from the first game. Like in the first game, there are so many spells, skills, there's so many like, little upgrades and progression points that the player is kind of, I think, lost in like the grand scheme of things. It's not like Dark Souls, like we said, where leveling up your character or get a new piece of armor, it's like, that's great, but if you don't know how, properly use your weapon, you're still gonna get killed by that boss, no matter if you're using the best weapons or not. And with Neo, there are so many like game-breaking spells and powers in that game that instead of, I think, nerfing them or trying to get around it, what they did was kind of embrace that with Neo 2 in the way that enemies have all been sped up, their recovery times are a lot shorter or quicker, and it is far more frustrating to fight them and how much they can react, and you don't have that ability. And it feels like they did that on purpose because they know players are going to use those spells or those overpowered abilities, and those are just kind of their way of making the enemies fight harder. But if you don't use those abilities, then it just feels like you're walking into a gunfight and you have a spoon when you're trying to fight these guys.
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with the developer that adds abilities and expects you to use them, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think that's okay. I just feel like I think in your case, right, they made a mismatch
Mm-hmm.
by creating a robust enough melee system. I mean, sometimes we get the message, right? That
Mm-hmm.
means this is the way I'm supposed to solve
Yeah.
things, and these other things that are powerful are supposed to be like a smart bomb in a
Yeah.
shmup or something, right? And it's like I don't use smart bombs in shmups. And then in this case though, it doesn't work out, and suddenly it's a mismatch.
Yeah.
I mean, because you feel like some games have taken the kind of the opposite route, or the more extreme route, where they just take away all the basic moves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a sequence of big hits with maybe long cooldowns,
Yeah.
kind of like I don't know, more of like a you're the boss in a boss fight, and that's like what your character can do. And I think that there's a lot of room to make that interesting, but then you got to message it super clear, right? And you
Yeah.
kind of have to. I think you run a risk if you create a game experience that shares all the same things with another game experience. People are going to think it's that game experience and
Yeah.
not the one you're putting together.
Yeah. And to Mr. Elroot's point, I think we were talking about it with like low stakes and casual games. The thing about Neo 2 is that the spells that I'm talking about are hidden kind of within their skill trees. It's not something you're going to start the game with. You have to purposely build your character towards those specific items. And the ones I'm talking about are the Sloth Talisman, which basically it cuts any enemy's movement by half. And when we say movement, I mean this includes bosses. So that high speed boss becomes even slower than a normal Dark Souls enemy when that spell hits them, and it completely changes the dynamic of that fight.
Man, snares are powerful.
Oh yes. But all right, there you go. My
I
headset's
think you're
back.
breaking.
Okay, there we go. Uh, but I think that is a good segue into talking about the RPG aspect of a Souls like, because that has been kind of the other side of the coin when we talk about their appeal, and something I think Draken mentioned earlier is not being a fan of. That on one side of things, you have that action layer we talked about, the random pattern fights, the kind of more methodical combat. But then you have this idea of kind of borrowing or kind of taking some aspects of an ARPG and putting them into these games. And we've seen, and again, this is where we can kind of start to break down stuff like Code Vein versus Neo versus Dark Souls, different layers of RPG gameplay on top of things. So, what do you think about kind of the RPG side of a Souls like?
Well, I mean, I think that in order to kind of accommodate really long hours of engagement with an experience, you do need some long-term progression in there. And it makes sense now that you're going to have some RPG elements in the game. You what you give as a reward and how those rewards kind of grow or progress. There's a million different ways to approach that, but I mean, first of all, I do think it's necessary, and probably, the way the Dark Souls series handles it might be kind of the right balance.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's worth noting all of these RPG progression schemes are very much just an offshoot of or a continuation of something really essential to these kind of old school console Japanese kind of melee combat games, where they all had their own, they always rolled their own progression scheme and their own
Mm-hmm.
level up and acquisition of new moves, the gaining of new weapons. You know, we all remember when we got the Orion fists from Devil May Cry. Anytime you get a new weapon, it's a great moment in these games. Even like a game like first God of War,
Mm-hmm.
when you shifted into the next weapon, it does a great thing for the experience. And at its core, these the Souls-like games are still basically those games. They've just rearranged or reconfigured the kind of the difficulty curves, what is hard, what rules you have to live by to succeed,
Mm-hmm.
to create their kind of new, and it'd be probably safer to call it kind of like a subgenre of that old type of game. And so in some ways you can think of it as just that all these developers have their way they want to tell the story of how you go from being the beginning version of the protagonist to the end version of the protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
Although if I had to say like what I favor, I do like it more when it like things like adding one attack to a combo that has a special feature. I like adding to it back when they had jumps,
Mm-hmm.
adding to jump a downward attack or adding to jump a
Mm-hmm.
double jump. Like I was always a fan of mechanical improvements that changed the way I'd be hitting buttons, because that just felt right. But it was probably because I was conditioned by those games from back then.
Yeah. And again, that's kind of one of the big things about Souls-like compared to traditional action games is that typically they don't introduce mechanic growth while you play them. Like you're going to get all your move sets, all the kind of your core abilities, probably in like the first 5 minutes of play, and then it's just kind of how many times we can, turn that on its head against the player. Oh, you like parrying? Here's a super fast enemy that you can parry. Oh, you don't want to parry? Here's this giant, swordsman who, will kill you unless you can properly time those parries to repose them. And one of the things they did, like, probably like the ultimate example of this would be something like Bloodborne, or at least in the From Software line, where Bloodborne is probably next to Sekiro, like the fastest of their combat systems. And what they did was each weapon has the same basic move set, but how that weapon behaves is entirely different. Using the sword cane is different than I think one of the ones I was like this giant hammer that you can lay it on fire by hitting like a flint on your shoulder, and then it turns into a fiery mallet.
When I think there's a lot of sense behind that. Like, I was always blown away by games that would have like several weapons, because each weapon basically requires an entirely new animation set, and
Mm-hmm.
those animation sets are part of the more costly things that you try to get into a game. And it's not just the animating itself, right? It's once those animations are in place, there's getting it right and there's tuning it up so that it feels like a great player package. And we know from the games that have been successful that a handful of good moves that you use over and over and over again is better than way more moves that are sloppily put together and
Mm-hmm.
or maybe too situational in their use. Um, and so I think in a lot of cases, or I feel strongly that in a lot of cases, the devs end up making those choices to save resources, and then that they're kind of designing the game. How do we work around the fact that it's so expensive to do this? And in the case of Dark Souls, if you got too many more moves, that would throw a huge wrench in the overall system of how
Mm-hmm.
how the interactions with the AI would be,
Yeah.
and maybe an overwhelming one, and one that couldn't be recovered from, in terms of kind of the tight experience we see today.
Yeah, and I think like part of what makes like that line of a good Souls like is just how much does the RPG side factors into the basic gameplay. Because as we've said over the course of this recording, over the course of the stream, that so much of a good Souls like is a very heavily tuned system, and if you introduce anything that kind of breaks that or kind of renders that meaningless, the experience tends to suffer for it. And I think that's one of the reasons why other Souls likes that try to instill more of that just feel kind of awkward to me. Did you ever have a chance to play The Surge by any chance?
No, no, I haven't.
The Surge is I think it was done by Deck 13. It's more of a sci-fi take on the Souls like. And
Hmm.
that one I think there's a lot more in terms of RPG leveling in that one. Like you have to equip these various modules that give you either perks or new abilities, and it always felt awkward to me to play. And there's something I think a conversation about like what it means to play different Souls likes. Because I know for Sekiro that a lot of people have said that if you love Souls likes, you may not like Sekiro. But if you've never had that experience of a Souls like, it may be the better game for you.
Yeah, well, and I think we're blurring some lines
Mm-hmm.
too, right? It's like the space that a Souls-like could take up because Dark Souls series has been so successful. It's now created kind of like a territorial border around
Mm-hmm.
what its game design is about. But
Mm-hmm.
that territorial border overlaps a lot with other types of games,
Yeah.
right? And I think Sekiro is just on the other side of that borderline where it becomes a little more just kind of straight up 3D, action adventure but slasher focused, and I think that sometimes people might move into some of these other games expecting the kind of experiential engine that the Souls-like games offer,
Mm-hmm.
only to be surprised when it's a different set of things that'll drive things.
Yeah. And that I think is a good point to talk about kind of when we look at Code Vein and Neo that really embrace other aspects of RPG design with their games. Neo in particular has full on randomly generated loot. It goes more for the ARPG side. While Code Vein seems to embrace more of this you're going to build your own character out of these various passive gifts and blood codes, and then that will dictate what you can and can't do in combat.
Yeah, and Code Vein has that kind of neat thing where as you kind of progress, you don't have to replay to have the abilities, right? You just choose what you want in the moment,
Mm-hmm.
set yourself up, and then that'll dictate your play style. And there's basically kind of like two and a half play styles sort of, and depending on which how you mix and match, you kind of lay on one of those paths.
Mm-hmm. The only thing that I didn't like, or at least from what I played so Code Vein, was that it does again kind of obscure some of your choices. Like when you choose a new blood code, and all of a sudden you see all your stats change. It's kind of hard to tell at the moment. What does this all mean? Like what is having going from B plus in strength to B is going to affect for my character?
I still have no idea really.
Yeah.
I mean, to be fair, those are the kinds of the when those walls of stats in those kinds of games, because so much of it's trying to describe what the action experience is
Mm-hmm.
about. You'll end up ignoring half the numbers, and then just there's just a few numbers that'll matter. But
Mm-hmm.
even those numbers don't matter because really all that matters is how it plays, right? Do I kill the guy in 3 hits? I know I kill him in 3 hits with this.
Yeah.
I know this guy takes 2 hits. I know this guy takes like 8 hits, and I have to watch out for X, Y, or Z. It's not nearly as punishing as Dark Souls,
Mm-hmm.
but it's still difficult. But the reality was that all these games were difficult back then, and that's they're all in. Do they? Can we say safely that they all generally revolve around the overcoming of the obstacle? That they're all
Mm-hmm.
Fiero-based games. And I think
Yeah.
that is true. Um, but when you're talking about how much RPG progression influences things, and that changes the type of game quite a bit, though, right? Like if we go
Mm-hmm.
to the Darksiders, like 1 and 2 at least, because I didn't play Darksiders 3. I love those games, but they're not. They're more like Zelda in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of ways. They're more like hard, conventional game design balance and ability upgrades in an adventure setting.
Yeah.
And it's funny. I remember back in Darksiders 1, people complaining about the game because it was just a Zelda ripoff, is what I heard. And I'm like, it could be a whole lot worse than that.
Yeah. And now everyone is saying, "Oh, it just rips off Dark Souls." Now that's like the new thing.
And if it's a good ripoff, it's like, oh no.
Mm-hmm. And like that kind of, I think with some of with Code Vein, it does seem like it feels like there's more room to kind of mess up in that one. I think having a co-op partner really does like flip the script, because as anyone who's played a Souls like knows, two versus one fight just immediately escalates it difficulty by like 500%. And when it's you who gets that 2-on-1 with an enemy, it feels like it's a lot more relaxed than would be with a Dark Souls.
Yeah, no, and I feel like that is kind of at least a small way in which they open up the accessibility of it. Um, and it's a pretty solid experience that way too. It holds up, which is strange because it's pretty different experience at that point. I mean,
Mm.
I'm kind of surprised in a lot of ways at how much kind of walking around with swords and co-op is something that's kind of been making good progress.
Hmm. So let me
I
check
mean, I've been
off.
out of that game for a long time, development wise, so I guess maybe I should just pay more attention.
In terms of time, we are about like I think like 56 minutes. I know we're shooting for about like an hour 15. So let's get to. There's definitely 2 points I want to discuss. One would
For
be
sure.
like storytelling, and one is obviously going to be world design because that's another very big point. So let's get to world design because I think, like you said earlier, it's like this kind of Disneyland. Like Demon Souls, I think, was a game that kind of brought this idea of environmental design into these kinds of games, where it's not just here's 30 interconnected hallways that have no rhyme or reason to them. We're going to build a literal village, and there's going to be kind of a flow to it. And it's not, I think, outside of something like a Valve with like Half Life and Half Life 2, and then what we saw then later with Arcane, with Prey and Dishonored, it really has become like a major aspect of these games with this idea that you are designing a world, not just these individual segments or rooms.
So there's it's a fairly sophisticated art department skill,
Yeah.
right? To be able to create an environment that, on the merits of its visuals alone, do more than just look good, also influence your decision making and communicate information to you. Um, obviously the World of Warcraft team did a very, very good job of this.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the much of this knowledge existed in theme park design well before it existed in video games, and video games learned it from the kind of Disneyland methodology.
Mm-hmm.
The World of Warcraft folks like talking about it directly, but I think that like the kind of long haul lineage of kind of Japanese console games, that it was a way of thinking about the level and dragging people through the space that was in the same vein, that just took a while to really get to kind of high level of sophistication. And there are outliers in our past, where their kind of set design and skills are really good, and those games probably are remembered really fondly. But I think what we see in recent years is like this skill kind of becoming stable
Mm-hmm.
and becoming predictable. That they know what they're doing, and it's kind of becoming straightforward in their execution. Like everything about Dark Souls 3 especially is just, it's like you can tell it tells like an entire backstory about these ruins, like a slideshow. It's like you're at like an archaeology professor's set of slides presentation while you happen to be killing these things. Um, there's and I mean, this is a lot of this is really kind of basic entertainment related stuff. Like it's kind of the essence of what um, kind of like cinematography is all about, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does the visual information on the frame say? Just set very focused on the setting and the geography that you're in. But yeah, man, I'm feeling it's cool to see that the quality of the world and the way the world communicates with the player and how it
Hmm.
guides that player through itself, seeing that skill improve over time. And you can definitely see when people don't know how to do that. And it's okay. Maybe, if you don't know about that, start doing research about the design of theme parks and try to do better. Or maybe don't make a game where it's really essential that you're good at that.
Yeah. And I think I remember a talk. I think the developer, I forget his name. Let's see, of Demon Souls. Uh, oh, here's Hitaki Miyazaki, and he gave a talk about kind of the level design that they did or they approached with Dark Souls, and it was this idea that the world was kind of connected, and it was almost like the level design is more circular than it is kind of like a long hallway. Because, like we said, like when most people think about video game design, like something like Doom or the old school first-person shooters, it's just like kind of like these very long stretches of hallways. You're going to move. You're never going to return to an area. Because why would you? Because it's just this constant forward momentum. But with something like in a Souls-like, these worlds are very much they're deeper than they are wider. There's this idea that that door that's right next to the start that could just literally be the shortcut that takes me to the end of the level because the whole level kind of like wraps around in of itself.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of different pieces of that. Uh-oh, I think our stream might have died.
Uh,
Um, but so yes, right, that you want to break the deadlock of environments that are built just so you pass through them, and featureless and sameness, they're all things to avoid. But there's like a whole lexicon to how you manage visually through an environment, manipulate or modify the player's perspective on things, right? You can have
mm-hmm,
We're starting to see like a regular cadence of a beautiful vista, and what you see in the distance inevitably is a place you're going to go, and it's majestically positioned, and it looks beautiful, and it's memorable. And then you go back down into the valley and you don't see it, but you see it here and there between like the mountains, or when you get a view out of the valley. And that's this kind of foreshadowing and this kind of leading you forward through the space. There's a visual story that's being told, and when people start getting good at it, it's the same as any kind of storytelling or any kind of system. And you get good at it and you pace it right. Let's go little big. Uh, one choice, one path to follow, four paths to follow, one path to follow, a bunch of little offshoots. You got to search each one of them. You get something good at the end of them, and eventually you find the way to go.
mm-hmm,
And then you just keep switching up the way these spaces speak to you, and then mixing in the gameplay elements. Um, there's like there's there You could talk about it from so many different points of view. Um,
mm-hmm,
and all those points of view are valid, but the people that do it best kind of use the full lexicon, and they keep switching things up and making it interesting.
mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess what you said a minute ago about like a bad example, without you don't have to name names, but what would you consider to be a poor example of trying to do this environmental level design right?
I think that it's not a bad example, but when you bring up Doom, that it wasn't a focus. There's
Mm-hmm,
still I mean, original Doom, actually the level design is quite good, but it leans very heavily on enemy design and spaces
mm-hmm,
that make taking them down interesting and fun. If I had to, I feel like there are probably a handful of first person shooter campaigns where maybe the level designs are a little anemic, because there's a period of time where multiplayer in those shooters was the focus, and so the campaigns kind of got short shrift after that, and sometimes they would kind of get put together in a bit of a
mm-hmm,
hasty fashion. That's not really talking about maybe the last 10 years, because in the last 10 years those games have gotten so big and their budget have gotten so big that the people that work on those single player campaigns, including Medal of Honor, which I worked on, we put a lot of effort into all of these rules. That's all we do. We're set designers, and we scatter AI in there so you have something to do while you move through the beautiful spaces.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'll think just a tiny bit as you maybe you want to introduce your storytelling last point, and then I'll think a little bit about a good example for something that didn't work out well
Okay.
and why.
And to something Draken said earlier, just to briefly mention a Remnant from the Ashes. I really enjoyed that one. It's kind of like, of all the kind of off brand Souls likes, I think that one is my personal favorite. Just again, like we've said, like over the course of this discussion, that you really need to get the basic mechanics right for a Souls. Are we dead again? Oh no. Uh, yeah, I think what I will be doing is I have this recorded, like just as we're about to start. I think I will upload that as kind of this version for this talk, just to be on the safer side.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I haven't seen. Actually, I was watching another video of yours while that was going on in the last couple minutes.
But what I was saying was, with something like with Remnant from the Ashes, it is a third-person shooter, kind of with that more methodical take to it, as with a Souls-like. And I really hope that we see more of that kind of trying to do more in a Souls like rather than just it's more swords or it's more axes and shields and things like that. And again, like we could easily like start getting to the minutia of what does Bloodborne do differently from Dark Souls? What is different from Dark Souls and Code Vein?
Well, I think I would generally be inclined to say that if you can make a really good Souls-like experience, even if it's really there's nothing new that you're bringing to the table, that it's probably a worthy effort. It's extremely high difficulty, I guarantee that. But if you're able to make a solid Souls-like experience, that the people that really like that experience, they're they're on board for more. They could handle another title in the space, and they'd soak it up. They'd be
Mm-hmm.
happy to have that difference of experience, provided it's good. I mean, if you were, and maybe not quite as good, would still be good enough. If it was a lot worse, you're probably in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you know what the best example of repetitive space design for at least big chunks of the experience?
Mm-hmm.
First Halo.
Mm-hmm.
First Halo has a lot of very repetitious, literally identical environments. Now, thankfully, its AI kicks so much butt that it's still pretty awesome. But at that point, like when you're going through the snowy levels, where you're going through those corridors, and then you go back through those corridors, and then they're just kind of cutting and pasting a lot of those before you get into the kind of the big open set piece areas.
Yeah.
That I mean, when you're looking at first level of Dark Souls 3, every little bit of it's been custom staged and leading to a new space. Many modern first person shooter um, single player campaign now they wouldn't dare do that. And to be fair, none of the games I'm thinking that wouldn't dare do that have AI at the level of quality perhaps that Halo did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And to this day with Destiny, that's still kind of the best selling point, right? It's that fighting interesting enemies is really good and it's really hard, so they don't have as much competition, which is kind of the same game as this Dark Souls stuff.
Yep. And I think like when we talk about good level design like this, like the level design really does matter to the gameplay. I think that's kind of where we see that distinction between, excuse me, between between old school games like Doom and Quake, and kind of more these more modern entries where a Dark Souls game, if you're not paying attention where you're going, you're gonna either get backed up into a wall and get killed, roll over a edge and die, or you may not notice that guy who, right in the corner aiming a crossbow at you, just as you're about to hit his friend, stun lock you right there. And it's never. I think the more fascinating about Souls like is that it's never, or at least the better ones, it's never been about kind of like the arena lockdown that we see from pure action games. Where you walk into a room, every door closes, and you're going to be in there until you kill 20, 30 enemies. Souls like games are very dangerous with few numbers. One tough enemy, like the black armored knights in Dark Souls 3, they will wreck you. Like, they don't need like 4 or 5 guys. One of them is bad enough on their own.
Yeah, every time you see one, you have to take a breath and you
Mm-hmm.
need to focus. And I think that's where the selling point of the experience is, right? That there are no freebies.
Mm-hmm.
You have to earn it, but it's not so hard that you can't earn it, provided you're willing to learn what to do and then stick to it. And I think that's a simple statement, but it's so easy to in non Souls-like games. None of
Mm-hmm.
that happens,
Yeah.
right? It's that, hey, I want to take it easy on you. I want you to be happy, and I have no problem with those other games. In fact, I play mostly those other games. It's that it's just a different product that you're selling at that point,
Yeah.
and sometimes more focused on the larger story. Although digging into the story of Dark Souls is some good stuff. It's really interesting,
Oh
and they
yes.
that's another it's another entire talk worth of how you a not so overt storytelling mechanism of having all these little details you can soak up.
Mm-hmm.
Bungie does a great job of that too, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
But they also do a great job of the overt storytelling at the same time. So they're kind of like Bungie and Blizzard. I kind of put kind of like on this kind of bleeding edge of big conventional game storytelling, the pinnacle of it, sort of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that is probably as good of a segue as we're going to get to this final point. And again, with something like with a Souls like any one of these is a good 2 to 3 hour talk. So I'm sure at some point in the future we're going to be discussing or breaking down another Souls like for one of these episodes. But the storytelling aspect has been one of the more interesting aspects of it. Again, like Demon Souls and the first and Dark Souls 1 kind of, I think, took a lot of people and just like blew them away in terms of what they did. And the storytelling is one of those big aspects. It is, as you said, it's very much like covert, or it's very much not in your face in terms of the storytelling. There's been arguments, I know Sharks talk about this, in terms of whether or not that is storytelling or just world lore. Like, are you really being guided by the story in a Souls like? And
I get. Oh, go ahead, continue.
no,
Sorry.
no, but feel free.
I, I was just going to say that I don't know if there's any difference, right? Giving you a piece of lore versus telling you what happened next in the story, is that the differentiation that we're talking about there? It's all the same material, right? Like,
Mhm.
I can drop you a hint, or someone can use the name of a city and not tell you anything about it. It's starting to fill in background details. You don't know what it means, but it's heading somewhere.
Mhm.
It's kind of similar to a character having a conversation with you and acting skittish. Well, what are they covering up? And then we tell you eventually. It's all storytelling in its own sort of way. But in this Dark Souls model, or at least, there are a lot of other types of games that do it this way, but this kind of voluntary, because if I don't pay attention, I don't get the story.
Mhm.
Some games, like, it stops the action and a cutscene starts and the main characters say something like, I'm going to destroy the world, and some other character says, like, I'm going to stop you. Like, very overt and pretty obvious.
Mhm.
But now it's like, if we hide all this interesting information that will interconnect in things like item descriptions and little messages that I don't even have to look at,
Mhm.
all over the place in these really tiny chunks that, as I scoop them up into a big pile, start meaning something. It's kind of an analogy, I guess, for the actual experience of playing the game. It's like, it's up to you. You
Mhm.
got to figure it out. But once you figure it out, you'll feel satisfied because you did the work, and then we gave you the reward.
And that's like the thing about like wow, mouth is messing up there. Specifically, Souls likes that was not easy to get out. That when you look at the Dark Souls franchise as a whole, most of that story, unless you are really paying attention, you will not really know what happened in those games. Like, their endings have been, famously very disappointing because you have to basically follow the entire lore to actually understand what's going on. For most people, it's just like, yeah, I lit the bonfire, now the world, and now it gets dark, the end. Okay, that was my ending there.
Well, I mean, it does take a pretty big commitment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not all the types of players that are up for the hard skill challenge and that kind of analytical focus that's required while playing are also then at the same time in parallel, like in a position to start accumulating bits of uncertainty that I kind of just like toss in my pocket and wait to add up to something. Like sometimes those behaviors aren't the same person most of the time, and so it's hard. I know. I mean, probably most of the people that play Dark Souls don't really absorb much of the story, but
Mm.
if you do take it slower and you do take the time to go through it like that, it can be a pretty rich experience. I mean, I like using any Bungie stuff as an example as well, or World of Warcraft also. But like in Destiny, there's all this flavor, but all the flavor connects is internally consistent, connects to each other, and starts painting bigger pictures. And you don't have to spend the energy because people like to have all their conspiracy theories basically
Mhm.
around what's actually happening in these universes, and it drives conversation, makes a
Mhm.
lot of interesting what if. That's not to say, even in the context of Dark Souls, that they don't do the conventional storytelling well. I was remember when we first started talking today. I mean, I just kind of loaded up Dark Souls 3 again and taken a look at that intro cutscene, and it is good. And I don't even know what it's saying.
Yeah, and like with like the storytelling of these games, what's very fascinating, like you said, like it is like how much you put into it, you're going to get out of it. It's very similar, like in some sense, to the mechanics of these games. That if you want to learn these systems, you are going to get reward for it by just being able to crush every enemy. And if you want to learn the story, they give you all the pieces. It's up to you to put it together. And if Thorn is watching this either live or record, like we've had discussions about all the crazy elements of these story aspects of the Dark Souls franchise. And like one of my favorite scores is Bloodborne, as a really like pushing like Lovecraftian eldritch themes in that one.
Nice.
And what's very interesting about like from a storytelling and world building standpoint is that it really does, like, even if you don't embrace it, it still adds, I think, a very necessary layer to these games. Like, there is something going on. And that actually takes me to one point I wanted to ask you. I want to ask this to the people watching this live or recorded. The whole aspect of the essentially you have infinite lives in these games. Like, this is one of those things that is just very interesting to discuss. I think from both a mechanical and a philosophical standpoint, that the stories of these games are basically designed around the fact that the protagonist can never truly die. In Dark Souls, the whole idea of I forget the exact term they use, the marked one or the unkindled or something like that. That
Yeah.
it's this idea that when we look at most video games, the story's built around, you can't die. It's you against the world. But in a Souls like, it's basically you will die and you will come back and you will push just a little bit further next time. And I think it just gives a very different feel.
It's a little Edge of Tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
a little Infinity Blade. It's this whole, I think there's this modern storytelling discovery, right? That
Mm-hmm.
we can use the story to make sense of the endless respawning that we have in our games and make that a part of the narrative. And then once you start that process, then you start realizing there's all these things we could add to it.
Mm-hmm.
Is what should happen the more you respawn? Does that have something to do in the mythology of this world? Is it using up some resource? You have to go gather that resource to respawn more, or or like in Infinity Blade, you're coming back 1,000 years later again and again and again. So it's like, well, what is the course of infinite history then? And how do we make that interesting and fun? Make players kind
Yeah.
of just get their thoughts going. And then of course we have all the TV shows these days with like Westworld and Devs and Legion, all that, all this kind of mind bending, even
Yeah.
anything that's time travel related, right? Just kind of
Oh yes.
break the conventional shape of our world, and don't tell a story that says you're the hero and there's a bad guy and you're going to take him out, and then whenever you die we just set you back in the story a bit. It's like, no,
Mm-hmm.
no, no, the dying is part of this story. You're this eternal soul, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like you only exist because of this imbalance that you're here to correct.
Mm-hmm.
And then make the repeated play experience reinforce and add to your play experience, or the story of the world that's going on. It's all really good stuff, and it's really fun stuff to kind of get into.
Yeah, I think we did have a talk about Hades, and I really loved in Hades about how they just basically welcome this idea of a roguelike, and that's part of the world lore because you're a demigod. You are supposed to, you can't be killed. So you
Yeah.
die, you're going to come right back. And he's just very nonchalant about how, oh, I have to fight you again, or I beat you last time, so what do you think's going to happen this time?
And then even some of your peers going like, "Man, you have a lot of will to keep this up. You've been trying for a long time." And this, like the way they take just the beginning part, and they're those characters like your dad and like those various characters walking around, that talking to them many times is what changes what they say,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of in this kind of iterative repeat play type of pattern slowly increments the story forward. It's well thought out and it's good stuff. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean, well, Hades also has probably the best random generator, like level run builder of anything I've seen.
All right, here's the final question, or like our final topic, and then we'll wrap things up. Because if we're talking about
Sounds
Souls,
good.
like there's one thing that always comes, or it's something that's come up a lot over the last decade. The idea of something being the new Dark Souls. And we've had this, again, like it's something that we've said many times here that, anytime a game tries to do something difficult, we call, it's the Dark Souls of platformers, or it's the Dark Souls of cooking games, or restaurant sims, or anything like that. So, my final question I want to pose to you is this: everything that we've talked about, if you were to kind of, wrap it up, like when we say what is a Souls like, or what is a Dark Souls experience, what do you think are the major qualifiers of that?
I mean, I guess I'd call it an action harsh puzzle game. And I'd use puzzle because it requires you to follow the rules to solve the challenges. It's action. There's timing. Your ability to respond to what you see is essential. And that's the hard, and that it is harsh, right? That there aren't. It's not like if you make a mistake that sometimes there's a consequence. It's that mistakes are punished.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that those three pieces of the experience combine to create a really good environment to gain satisfaction from overcoming obstacles.
Mm-hmm.
That would probably be my approach to the generic description of it.
Do you think the punishment system in a Souls like, do you think that adds, takes away, or doesn't have an effect on the gameplay? When we say punishment, we mean, of course, you die, and any accumulated resources for that run are left where your blood pool is, and if you get back to
That's
it,
not much punishment
yeah. But for
because you can get it back.
some people, it's basically I'm going to throw my controller against the wall if I lose 10,000 souls.
No, and that's a harsh. But that's the thing is right. The game is actually there to try to condition you, right? The
Mm-hmm.
experience is part of this game is you pay attention. Part of
Mm-hmm.
this game is slow the hell down. You want to run and gun through single player levels? It's like go pick up Serious Sam. And Serious Sam is a great skill game, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it's the kind of game where you're going to move and you're going to destroy, and it's
Mm-hmm.
the you're never going to stop your forward motion. Dark Souls, you gas the pedal and you're just speeding up how fast you die.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
How many
and so
times?
I think that
Oh,
what
go
was
ahead.
that?
Finish your thought. I was about to say something, but go
I was
finish.
just going to say
Yeah.
like that it's an integral part of the experience, which is to appreciate the risk and use your mind to solve the puzzle. The punishment is essential in that regard. And even if the punishment really just is you take more damage or you don't get to do damage, like it's still true at that level as well.
Mm-hmm. And what I was saying was like, how many times are people watching play a Souls like? Well, I say what I'm about to do when I run past enemies. You're not supposed to do this. You like do not just like run full tilt to a group of 6 guys and try to dodge around them. That will most likely end up with most people dying there.
When it's not the thing to do in a Souls game, but I do like the idea of running past 6 enemies in a game like this and grouping them up and having some cockamamie plan to take them all out really easily with like a cool set of moves and try it over and over again until I figure it out. I love that. But obviously in the case of Dark Souls, that's not, it hasn't been designed as a reasonable way to approach the game. And it's like, and I don't begrudge any player for trying to enjoy games in a way that is different than is optimal for the game. But once you know what's optimal for the game, if it's something that you like, you can go to Dark Souls, get that well-crafted experience, and get a lot out of it. And then maybe if you wanted to do something different, like group up large amounts of enemies and blow them to smithereens, maybe you want to play 99 Nights or something.
Or something like the Dynasty Warriors franchise, where you're just like,
Yeah.
10,000 enemies. That's a normal fight for you in that kind of game.
Well, that's kind of makes me feel like, have you played 99 Nights?
No, I have not.
I think they go by N3, by the way, which kind of annoys me that they call 99 Nights N3. Sort of upsetting way of describing 99 Nights, but it is basically Dynasty Warriors, but add an extra 0.
Or
check it out. It's probably easy to find a old version of it or something nowadays.
or something like Earth Defense Force, or the better one. There's like
Yeah.
armies of bugs and all that. Yeah. So I guess.
Well, and nowadays even some of the games like Ultimate Battle Simulator, Ultimate Epic Battle Simulator, like that stuff is getting kind of interesting. There's some movement there. You were gonna say?
I was just gonna say, like, for like my final thoughts, like, for me, a good Souls-like, I think, to build off what Tomo said, is that it is very much a game that rewards your understanding and your master of these mechanics. That it's not something where you can just repeat the same thing again and again and you're going to win. And it's why, like, my favorite fights in the game are those that really force you to kind of adapt, and I always use the term pivot when you're playing against them. So like a Champion Gundyr, Father Gascoigne in Bloodborne. The fact that you can't just, okay, I'm just going to dodge and do slash slash and repeat that 20 times and I'll beat this boss. You actually have to learn these fights. And to me, it's kind of like almost like the opposite of like a shmup or a bullet hell shmup, where those games is about there's going to be this specific bullet pattern on screen, and I have to dodge it the same way every time. Whereas in a Souls like, I need to know, or like you said earlier, you have to kind of test the waters. Okay, when he swings his giant sword horizontally, is he going to fall with that? Yes. Okay, how do I react? No. Maybe this is a save point. And it's very much as kind of like on the fly kind of gameplay that I think I've really grown to love. That while you can prepare, while you can buy items or take healing or get better armor, at the end of the day, it's pretty much about what you're going to be doing for the next 90 to 200 seconds and whether or not you're going to win that fight.
Absolutely. I think to add to that, there's just the one word is you have to pay attention, or the one phrase, right? And that much of our entertainment experience is often selected so that I don't have to pay attention, right? It's like watching episodes of Friends or something versus watching episodes of Legion, for example. With Legion, you're not, even if you pay attention, you have no idea what's going on. Or we'll say, ever see the movie Primer, right? Primer is the kind of environment where you watch it and you're paying as much attention as you can, and you still can't quite understand it. It's hard. And then when you do understand it, you overcome the obstacle. And then you watch Friends and you're like, no, I'm going to get this episode is going to chill me out. I'm going to stop stressing about stuff. I'm going to enjoy what's there. I'm going to laugh at the jokes. And then maybe if I didn't get enough of that, I can watch another episode, right? Whereas if it's the Dark Souls style is, I played for a while, I used up my attention. I can't pay any more attention, so I got to stop playing. To be fair, we know plenty of people that have binged Dark Souls playing as well.
Yeah. And I think, again, it's that difference in the mindset that goes into it. Like you said, like, watching a show like Friends versus watching a show like Legion. Friends, you can kind of turn off your brain. You can just like tune out to it. Legion, and like with Dark Souls, you're kind of an active participant. You're the one who has to engage with it if you want to make any sense out of it. And it again goes back to this idea of a Souls-like, and why when people talk about them in such high regard, it is a genre or a style design that pretty much puts the player as the forefront. As we were talking about earlier with difficulty, like it wouldn't be the same game if you could just either bump up the difficulty by 10 levels or lower it by 10 levels. It's very much, I think you said it the best. It's a puzzle. You can't feasibly just artificially raise or lower the difficulty of a puzzle. It's really dependent on the person's own mindset, and if there are multiple ways of getting around it, there isn't. Wow, we're really on a tangent. It's kind of like the Zachtronics games, that there's no one way to solve the puzzle. Whatever satisfies a condition, that's a valid solution. And it's the same thing with Dark Souls. Do you want to beat this boss using nothing but daggers? Do it. Do you want to summon 3 friends and just, rip them apart with the soul spear or whatever spells you have? Yes. And neither one of those 2 ways is considered the ultimate, true way of winning. If you can, as long as you see you win or, boss is killed message, that's a valid way of playing.
Yeah, agreed. Although at the same time, it is because it's strict rules set.
Mm-hmm.
Some things will be harder than others,
yes.
And that there's no freedom on the player's perspective to try to solve it in a way that can't work.
Yeah.
They have to find a valid solution one way or the other. And what's interesting is RTSs were always hard back in the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I mean, the thing is, if we go far enough in the past, everything was hard.
Yeah.
That was like a normal thing, right? And it's interesting, at least in some ways, though, we can think of the Dark Souls genre as bringing difficulty back with a little bit of science, sort of.
Yeah. And again, it's not about pure difficulty, because oh man, I'm trying to resist these. Or again, like a Souls, that's like a 5-hour discussion. Like we really had the time, but I think ultimately, this will be my official final point. I'm going to slap myself on the wrist if we continue, but it's not about overwhelming difficulty. It's about, as Tomo said, it's about a puzzle. And some things are going to be easier or harder depending upon your own skill set. But ultimately, what makes these games work, similar to Zachtronics, is that if you understand how to solve Puzzle 2, that's going to infer on Puzzle 3 and Puzzle 4. If you don't understand that, you're going to have a harder time. And this is why for any Souls-like, that they normally get easier the further you play, because you are grasping those concepts. It's why that normal enemy who's super slow is going to kill you your first time, and then 15 hours in you can solo a boss and maybe not even get hit by it, because you've grown as a player and you've learned the pieces to solving this game.
I think that's a good summary. And I won't add anything to it so we can bring the stream to a close.
Or we'll talk for another 5 hours. And again, as long as the internet holds up, nobody will mind. But but let us wrap things up here. So, again, we will return to Souls-likes in the future, I'm sure. But as always, if you want to follow me, I am on Twitter at GWBicer. There is our link to our Patreon and Discord down below. And people want to follow you or Epic Tavern, Tomo, what are the best places?
On Twitter, we are at Epic Tavern. On Twitch, we are Epic Tavern. And our Discord channel can be found at discord.gg/Epic Tavern. More than happy to have you guys swing by and start up discussions about storytelling, game design, and the actual game itself.
Mm-hmm. Would Epic Tavern be described as the Dark Souls of anything, to keep with the theme of our cast?
Definitely not yet. We do have some aspirations, and actually in our dev chat session this morning, we did talk at some length about how difficult content would look.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. All right, so we like to do these episodes at least once a month, so I'm sure we'll have something exciting next time. And be on the lookout for another game design roundtable discussion that we'll be doing with our panel probably in the coming weeks. But check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. And we will talk to you all again next time for another great discussion about game development. Until then, take care.
Thanks for having me, guys. Bye.